Hello all, this is Steve from Game & Friends. I'm ranking each game in the Silent Hill series, from worst to best, and I'm going into detail on the elements that work and those that don't. And today, I'm talking about Silent Hill 4: The Room. Silent Hill 4 gets an awful lot of hate, which is really undeserved in my opinion. There are 3 reasons I can think of that might make Silent Hill fans hate this game so much, which I'd like to try and debunk. One is due to the rumours that it originally didn't start out as a Silent Hill game, so it wasn't a true Silent Hill. Another is the fact that the second part of the game is essentially one big escort mission, a trope utterly maligned in video games. And finally, there's the fact that you need to backtrack through almost every area you visit throughout the course of the game. I honestly don't think any of these reasons merit the disdain the game seems to get. They sound bad on paper, but let's address each separate issue. First of all, you shouldn't delude yourself in the way your favourite games are made. They have development cycles, where aspects are planned, scrapped, and borrowed from other popular franchises. Devil May Cry began its life as Resident Evil 4. If the developers had simply scrapped the project when it stopped feeling like Resident Evil, they would have wasted precious time and resources, and we would have missed out on an excellent action game experience. Pyramid Head doesn't come down from a mountain with the layout of these games carved on stone tablets. This is one of the few times I'll show genuine appreciation for Konami. They recognised elements of a good horror game in a project that was already being developed, and they utilised them to make a great Silent Hill sequel. You can complain all you want about greedy publishers just wanting to make a quick buck if the game turns out bad. But what's the point when the result is such a solid entry?
Oh man, that was awesome.
It's more understandable for people to be frustrated with the escort mission and backtracking, but again, I would like to argue their defense. In practice, I feel as though both aspects are particularly well executed. For one thing, Eileen, the woman you are escorting in the latter part of the game, can't actually die until you fight the last boss. Having their escorts die is the main reason people hate escort missions in games, when you are being punished for an AI's death and it doesn't really feel like your fault. Silent Hill 4 fixes that problem by removing death, so you don't have to worry about it. On top of that, you can also equip her with weapons, including a submachine gun for some reason, so that she can look after herself. These can only be equipped by Eileen, so you don't have to worry about her using up all of your ammo. This is a strategy that a lot of modern games have adopted in recent years, with your AI partner feeling far less like a burden and much more like an asset. In some examples, they are even more highly powered than the player themselves. In all honesty, I barely registered this as an escort mission when playing through it, because I never had to deal with any game-breaking bugs or character deaths. It's not pointless to have her as an escort either. The ending you get partially depends on how much damage she takes, which adds an optional layer of difficulty. This way, her progress doesn't hinder gameplay, and it gives you an optional incentive to protect her, which, to my mind, is the perfect solution. As for repeated locations, I feel as though this may be subjective. For me, I felt that each area benefited from being both pretty distinctive and quite short. I was never frustrated to see myself coming back to any of them. In fact, if I had only gone through each area once, I'm pretty sure I would have been annoyed at such a brief visit. The forest level in particular, I remember wishing I could have spent more time there. On top of this, it isn't a simple repeat each time. You don't simply begin at a new location. Your second visit to older areas also introduces a new mechanic, which is the ghosts. In every area you visit in the first half of the game, there is a gruesome death. The second time around, because this is Silent Hill, you have to deal with their vengeful spirit chasing you through the area. Each ghost has distinctive abilities, and you need to be able to adapt to each one if you're going to get through the area alive. Think of the game as being broken up into 2 segments. which are divided further into individual areas. Naturally, players will label these segments in terms of geography and see the second segment as a repeat. Segment 1 is the first playthrough of areas, and segment 2 is the second playthrough. If you think of it this way, of course it's going to feel disappointing. Instead, segment 1 should be labelled as exploration and familiarization, and segment 2 is more about panic and survival. This way, segment 2 is less a retread of geography and more an evolution of experience. It should come as no surprise from the points I'm making that I really enjoyed Silent Hill 4. And I think that's because, despite being developed at the same time as Silent Hill 3, it almost feels reactionary to that game. It goes out of its way to try new things, to be different from the core series in both obvious and subtle ways. This was a dangerous move considering the first 3 entries were critically acclaimed and sold very well. I think the developers were aware that they shouldn't mess too much with the formula in case they took away from what made the series so good. Having said that, I think they were also aware of the very slight level of fatigue setting in after the 3rd entry was released. In my opinion, one of the most effective changes they made is so subtle that most players probably aren't even aware of it. Whenever I think of Silent Hill 4, it always stands out to me because of the changes they made to the colour scheme. This is an almost childishly simple way to differentiate an entry, but in my opinion, it works surprisingly well. The previous Silent Hill games boasted a reddish-brown rust or fire motif that ran through the majority of the games. It could be argued to represent internal anguish, as that's something that affects all of the main characters. With The Room, the motif is largely grey or washed out colours. Considering how much time Henry spends looking out his window or looking at his TV with bad reception, I think the colour scheme is meant to represent a blend of wistful voyeurism and depression. I personally have always read Henry as being an agoraphobic introvert. He seems to feel uncomfortable in the outside world and with human interaction. Yet he still craves it, which makes him depressed and, truth be known, a little bit sleazy. If you pay attention to the beginning of the game, you discover that he is a photographer, and I think that's very telling. It reinforces the idea that he lives his life through other people, watching them without their knowledge, and never really living for himself. There have been more than enough depictions of emotionally unfulfilled photographers in film to support this theory. The game goes to great lengths to get this message across, most obviously on the occasions where you can spy on Eileen through a hole in the wall. You can also stare through your peephole at the other tenants in the building, listen to the conversations they have, and stare out at the people on the streets. Even when you do leave the apartment and go into the outside world, there is a filter effect that resembles old movies when the screen first loads up. I love this effect and the implications it has. It implies that the closest Henry gets to interacting with other people is simply watching TV. He feels a certain connection between his programs and the surreal events taking place, as if it is completely out of his control. It also suggests a little bit of ambiguity as to whether these events are even happening. Maybe he's still sitting in front of his TV, going slowly mad. The only way to travel to the outside world is through a tunnel in Henry's bathroom, and even the light at the end of this tunnel resembles television static. In a sense then, the room itself is Henry's closest friend, but it is also his prison, and that is conveyed perfectly in the gameplay. If you need to regain health, save your game, or just take a break from the pressure of the outside world, you go to your apartment to get away from it all. It's a bit like real life that way. It's a safe haven. Yet your motivation for the game, your reason for doing anything at all, is to escape your apartment. You can stay there if you like, but nothing progresses then. You just stagnate. I personally feel like this is a pitch-perfect metaphor for depression, and actually has an amazingly positive message behind it. in a really messed up sort of way. The room represents sanctuary at first, and that's fine. You go there to get away from the pain and cruelty that is other people. But as the game progresses, and the longer you are trapped in the room, the worse the room gets. It becomes possessed and feels increasingly claustrophobic. You still cling to it, knowing it's your special place. Despite the hauntings and paranoia, it still offers some solace in small doses. But pretty soon, it becomes obvious that you're going to have to either break out of your comfort zone, learn to live with it, or lose your grip on your own sanity. There's never a moment when the room very obviously becomes a worse place to be than outside. But because it mounts up so steadily and in your own personal space, it can feel overwhelming by the end of the game. Alienation is the key theme here, and developers really played the long game in conveying that. Older games in the series took the fears of the protagonist and used it against them. But it's different with The Room. Very few of the monsters really have much to do with you or your psyche. The monsters you encounter are more strongly linked symbolically to the antagonist, Walter. Most of them represent victims from the ritualistic killing spree he is on for the entirety of the game. The twin victim monster, for example, represents a pair of children Walter murdered prior to the events of the game. It could be argued that by severing the link between the player and the monsters, you cheapen the overall experience, that it loses its psychological edge. Normally I'd agree with this, but I don't think it works that way here. Consider Henry's disorder. He feels alienated, he feels alone, he feels completely detached from the world as a whole, and is obviously depressed. Surely it's an added sting for Henry that the monsters have no connection with him whatsoever. To simply represent the external evils that cause Henry to feel the way he does, even in the worst of circumstances, Henry isn't considered all that important, even to these creatures. This isn't even his story, he just happens to be a part of it. Whereas Silent Hill 3 weaved most of its symbolism through its creature design, Silent Hill 4 leans more heavily on its use of location. The very first area you explore is a twisted subway station. Traditionally, working your way through subways or airports is a frustrating and alienating process. These places are designed primarily to be practical rather than comfortable. You find yourself surrounded by people, rude, tired, unfriendly people, and it is very easy to feel lost, alone, and intimidated. For an agoraphobic like Henry, this really is a nightmare he can't wake up from. Other locations are equally effective at making the player feel alone and isolated. The forest world is one of the most spacious locations in a Silent Hill game, and feels surreally divorced from the other, more urban areas. And the sheer amount of doors that refuse to open to you in the apartment world would make anyone feel unwanted. One particular stroke of genius is the inclusion of the water prison world. As well as sharing all the previous world's attributes, it is also a prime example of the panopticon. The panopticon is a type of institutional building designed in the late 18th century. It allowed a single guard to watch all prisoners at one time without the prisoners being aware that they were being watched. Because the prisoners don't know when they are being watched, they must assume they are always being watched. You spend almost the entirety of this level exploring cells and never in the observation room itself. And interestingly, at odd intervals, you can hear footsteps coming from the central observation room, but it is never revealed who it is that is watching you. This is a near perfect inversion of Henry's comfort zone. In order to cope with his condition, he keeps himself locked away from the outside world while spying on his neighbours, living vicariously through them. Now, he is trapped in a prison where he is the one being spied on with no privacy and forced to keep moving in order to escape. The fact that the prison itself looks as though it exists in some kind of dreamscape is no coincidence. Henry really is quite a pitiful character when read this way, mostly because he himself doesn't draw a lot of attention to his disorder. He suffers quietly, but all of the clues are there. For one thing, he's incredibly socially awkward in all of his interactions with other people. Cynthia is a very attractive woman that Henry stares at from the window of his apartment. When he meets her in the other world, however, he doesn't really know how to act with her. She thinks she's in a dream and essentially throws herself at him, but even then he's awkward and evasive. Early on, you can overhear the landlord talking about what a quiet and odd guy Henry is, so he's clearly viewed as an outcast. It's also incredibly telling that we join Henry 5 days into his imprisonment, rather than just when the chains appear on his door. I feel like this is to emphasize the fact that depression isn't something that happens suddenly. It's very often a part of life. I mentioned that most enemies are strongly related to Walter's victims in terms of their design. And while this is true, I think it's notable how many of these enemies are in this situation. Stuck, in pain, trapped in a less than ideal predicament. These types of enemies show up in almost every world, anchored within walls, much like Henry himself. Seeing how calmly he views his horrifying predicament in the opening hours shows just how accustomed he is to being in his own personal hell. It is a nice apartment though, so I don't know, maybe that's a bit harsh. It's unlikely the room will gain the recognition it deserves because it takes pains to alienate its audience. The central character isn't likable or engaging, and some of the game mechanics are questionable. But when you take all of these supposed flaws in the context of the character's arc, then in my opinion, it is something of a masterpiece.